we are united by fate. In the case of Monte Sole, maybe it's not the same date, but events that have many similarities, but also some differences with the case of Lidice, Oradour, Distomo, and all the others that you can think about will emerge. This is our website. So for way more pictures, essays, and videos, and whatever, you can go there. And you have it in Italian, which I don't think it's so interesting for this audience, but you have it also in English and in German. And so, what is Monte Sole? Monte Sole is the name of a mountain. Sole means sun in Italian. And now it's the name of the entire area, an area that is 30 kilometers south of Bologna. So we are more or less in the center of Italy, near the border with Tuscany. But the region where this took place, it's called Emilia-Romagna. The capital of this region is Bologna. The massacre, as you can see, took place in a week. It started September 29th in the early morning, and it was considered done by the Nazi troops, meaning that they considered their military operation over the 5th of October of 1944. The area that you can see in the map is the area where the massacre took place, and you have the movements of the troops. We are speaking about more or less 1,000 soldiers. They belong to the 16th Division SS Reichsführer. It's an international division, so the commander is Austrian. Back then, of course, there was the Reich, so Austrian and Germans belonged both to the Reich. But the soldiers were not just Germans and Austrians. So if you come to Monte Sole today, if you want to see, that one is Monte Sole, that gives the name of the area, to the entire area. So nowadays is like that, and in many of the memory sites here, you can find panels. In many of the panels that were built by the Park Institution in the early 2000s, there is always written the Germans. The Germans arrived and killed the people. But we as a peace school, as you can see also here, prefer to call them Nazi. In order to point out that, of course, Germany is the name of the country, and not all the Germans were Nazi. There are people like Sophie Scholl who paid with their life. Of course, a lot of Germans supported the Nazi regime. But it's good maybe to distinguish a nationality from an ideology. And in the case of Monte Sole, it's even more relevant, because if we say the Germans, we don't enlighten the fact that among the Nazi troops there were people who were not born and raised in Germany and still behave exactly the same. There were at least 30 Italians, for example. So if you are in Italy and you write the Germans, it might look like a way to say they did it, only the Germans. And it risks to become a way not to face with the responsibility that also Italians had, not only because Italy is the country that invented fascism, but also because still in 1944 there were still Italians fighting together with the Nazi. So basically the soldiers surrounded the entire area, where back then there was 115 places with a name, mainly villages, so small villages, but some of them had their activities. There were shops, there were many churches, main squares. A lot of the people living there back then were farmers. And so for 1 week, the soldiers moved in this area, following more or less these arrows, and passed through every village. And when they were reaching a house, they were usually collecting the people and making the people enter a room, and then the soldiers were throwing hand grenades inside, and then usually shooting at the people. So at the end, the area was hit very hard, and nowadays if you come, you can see ruins. So here what you see are the ruins of a church, and there was the village around. It was not rebuilt. So now it's a historical and natural park. You have wild animals, there are deers, wolves, foxes, because there are many survivors who survived. In this area, there were 2,000 people living, but none of them ever came back to live there for multiple reasons, not only trauma, but also because the area was very unsafe also after the end of the war. The Nazi mined many of the fields. And of course, since no one was living there anymore when the war ended for Italy in April 45, it meant that it was not the first area that they thought to clean from mines. So some few families tried to go back and live in the area, but they realized it was too difficult. And if you lose your neighbors, your family members, and so on, for many of them, it was too hard also psychologically to think to go back there, basically. And now, one question for you is, on which side was Italy in Second World War?
First on Germany.
First with Germans.
Then they switched.
And then they switched. In 1943, Italy changed sides. How come that Italy changed side in the middle of the war? Who decided to change sides?
Mussolini.
Mussolini was for 20 years the only dictator, but it's not Mussolini who changed sides. Because Mussolini was in jail when Italy switched sides. Who put Mussolini in jail?
People.
The Italian police. So one key element that I didn't introduce but is good to have clear is this. So Italy starts the war on the side of Germany from 1940 with the invasion of Greece, which is a campaign that fascist Italy does on its own. There were no German troops already invading Greece. It's that at the beginning Mussolini thought Italy could create its own empire. And we already had many military operations before the beginning of the Second World War. Italy invaded Ethiopia, Libya, Eritrea, and so on. Where they also, Italian troops committed massacres of civilians. I'm saying this also because there is not so much memory about these war crimes also in my country, so I can imagine in other countries even less. So maybe it's good to know. And then in the first years of war, the Italian troops basically invade other countries. So the rest of the Balkans, Italy takes part in the invasion of Soviet Union, and there is the attempt to conquer Egypt against the British Army and the Commonwealth Army. But then the tide turns, and British and American armies defeat the Italians in North Africa. From their bases in North Africa, they land in Sicily in 43. Sicily is conquered very quickly, and then the Allied troops land in the south of Italy, and they climb towards Rome, the capital. So it's clear already in the summer 43 that Italy has lost the war. There will be no way that the Italian army is able to stop the advance of the Allied troops to the capital. Therefore, what happens is that Mussolini loses the power because inside the fascist party, other fascists votes against him. They blame on him the decision to join the war with an army that was not ready and so on. And he doesn't want to leave the power after 20 years. So the king of Italy, that was the head of the state, is the one who officially takes the power and makes Mussolini go to jail. Therefore, there is a new government. The new chief of the Italian government is a general, Badoglio, and this new government is the one who signed the treaty with the Allied forces, which is an armistice, 8th of September 1943. Now, it's very complicated. I will try to keep it short, but the story of Italy is always complicated. And so what happens is that soldiers, Italian soldiers, don't have clear orders on what to do. Many, like my grandfather, thinks when he hears on the radio that we signed the armistice, war is over, as many, many people in Italy. So he leave the gun and starts to go back from where he was to his hometown, which will take 1 week. But the Nazi Germany doesn't stand there just looking Italy switching sides. There were already German troops in Italy, others come, and basically they occupy the center and north part of Italy. And then, and they free Mussolini for the prison with a special operation. So Mussolini is brought to Germany. When he comes back in North Italy, he declares that now it's a new state. The Social Republic of Italy, which is a fascist state, he is the chief. So from that moment, in 43, Italy is split in two. There are two states. What is left of the Kingdom of Italy is in the south and stands on the side of the Allied troops and is a state which government declared the fascist party illegal. So all the anti-fascists that before were considered criminals and illegal, they come back also in North Italy and consider the true Italy that one. For them, it means finally, after 20 years, we got rid of the dictatorship and the fascist party. And our state is no longer that one, dominated by fascists. But in the center and north of Italy, there is this other state, whose chief is Mussolini, who claims to be the true Italy. Because for him, Italy means fascism. At the beginning, there is just the German army, maintaining order and suppressing opposition. But then he recreates an army. So, for example, my grandfather was called in the fascist army of the Republic of Mussolini. So it's a civil war for us, basically, from 43 on. Depending on where you lived in Italy, you were called to fight on one side or the other. But of course, people have ideas, and as well as you have people from southern Italy who came to north to fight for Mussolini because they were of fascist ideas, you had people like my grandfather who, despite being in the north and called in the fascist army, he didn't want to fight together with the Nazi, and he became a partisan. So both, yeah, depending on the period, but also in the last part, there were Italians on both sides. And so this is one of the reasons why the Nazi decided to do this operation, meaning that officially this area is under their control. The area of Monte was very close to the front line. That was also the Nazi defensive line, the Gothic line. For the Nazi army, it was very important to have this defensive line holding from September till November. They were sure that if the snow would have come on the Apennines, maybe, I don't know if you can see, but I can use the map of Italy that we all bring with us. I don't know if you see from there, but basically Italy is like that. You know, you see, Italy. But you have one. So, Monte is here. And basically, we have this chain of mountains in the middle of Italy. Okay? Here we have the Alps that are very high. But this chain, the Apennines, they don't attach like this. They turn like that. And the Nazi fortified this area because it was a way to cut from one sea to the other, Italy in two. Here is where, here in the north is where we have this big plain, where there is Milan, Bologna, Verona, Venice on the coast. So basically, for the Nazi, the point is, if they hold the Gothic line, they know that the war stays in Italy. If they lose there is this big plain, the Allied troops will easily conquer the rest of the north in a matter of probably 1 week, and then the war, the southern front arrives in the Reich also from the south. So in this period, they do several massacres. All of them are in this area near the front line. And why? Because partisans in that area, there were partisans everywhere in Italy in that period, in North Italy. But the partisans acting near the front line were considered more dangerous because they could harm the logistics. To defend a defensive line in the mountains means every day, every week, to bring ammunition, foods, the new troops on the front line and be able to retreat those who are wounded and so on. If you have a group of guerrilla fighters who do sabotages and can blow up bridges, it's a problem. Also because they act behind the front line. So you can see that the Monte Sole area has, let's try with a laser. So this is a river, and this is another river. And Monte Sole is here. And these are other mountains. And these are other mountains. So they surrounded the entire area from one river to the other because the fact that there was a partisan brigade here in the middle that could damage and destroy all these bridges that were attacking some of their soldiers was a problem for their line of supply. And they decided that the best way to deal with it, since previous attempts to get rid of the partisans were not really successful, because many of the partisans, not all of them, but many of them were originally from this area, so they knew where to hide. And they decided to destroy all the living places here. And it was so successful that this map that you have here, we have many, but this one comes from a war manual that was published in March 45 by the SS in a chapter that explains how to do effective counterinsurgency techniques. So they considered it a very well done operation. And indeed it was successful, even though they killed 10 partisans probably, and the partisans there in the area were some hundreds. Probably in the moment where they started the operation, there were 250 at least. So how come it's a success if only 10 partisans are killed? Because if you kill everyone here in the area and you turn the area in an empty space, no one can do guerrilla. The partisans could act only if there were farmers hosting them, hiding them, providing them food every day, you know. They were not hunting. Every day some farmers were bringing eggs and salami and whatever to these hundreds of people that were hiding in the woods. So it's a very cruel operation, but at the same time, in military terms, it's extremely effective. 8 years after, the area is still not populated. And this is the Peace School, this one on the left. And this is the only other building in the area here that is a restaurant that we use when we have groups. The Peace School was established in 2002 as a building, but the origin of my institution tracks back in the 90s, because many organizations and society of civil association belonging to civil society wanted to have in the middle of the area of the massacre a place and an organization that could deal with the past to work on the present. Some of these organizations are, for example, the Association of the Survivors of the Massacre, but also Amnesty International, associations that are made of teachers, educators, trainers, organizations involved in human rights. With the idea that if you work on the memory site, you can reach different aims that maybe are not always possible if you do a visit in a museum. So what we do is that we walk and we have workshop on the sites where maybe till some years ago, maybe there were also meetings with survivors that were in the place. Now it's becoming rarer and rarer because there are fewer and fewer of them. So maybe we read testimonies and then we reflect, usually in a circle. We do a lot of workshops that are very different. I will talk about it later. So just to say, the Peace School was born both by a bottom-up process, so civil society members who wanted to have a place dealing with this. Especially why in the 90s? Because in the 90s, some of these organizations were involved in dealing with the human rights violation and the war crimes that were happening in the Balkan area. Srebrenica was quoted already this morning. So for some of them, it was the first time to realize that this never again, even in Europe, was not true anymore. There were people who studied the Second World War who were killing civilians in massive numbers. So they thought maybe we should do something more or different if we really want this thing not to repeat. And there was also a top-down process, let's say, meaning that it was created then also because some institutions, like the regional council, the city of Bologna, the University of Bologna, a German state, Hessen, where Frankfurt is, as a form of reconciliation, they also promoted the creation of the foundation. So, some questions that we had to answer to ourselves, and we keep trying to find answers. What is the cultural role of a place of tragic memory? So, one challenge is how to let the complexity emerge. One small example I try to share with you is this one, like, for example, on the identity of the perpetrators. Maybe it's better if we explore the complexity of the fact that there were people that were not only Germans. Of course, it's easier to say Germans, but then we lose part of this complexity. We simplify in saying the Germans did these kind of things. How it is possible to reason about war and violence without making them reasonable? This is a very hard challenge that we face every day, meaning that when you start to try to understand the reason why the perpetrators committed such atrocities, there is this danger that you might even justify at a certain point. I think still nowadays, when it's about Nazi who committed violence, there is a limit to the empathy you give. So it provides a defensive shield against this risk. In other cases, maybe it holds less. So with some groups, for example, we reflect on the fact, maybe we ask them if they consider the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki a war crime. Because the problem is, if we say that this was justified because the Allies were the good ones, so they had to win the war, then there is a problem. Because then it means that we don't criticize the crimes in itself, but they depend on the identity of the perpetrator or the identity of the victim. But it happened to me. We work sometimes also with army, police, and so on in this work of violence prevention and human rights violation prevention. And once with the Canadian Army, for example, I had some of them who were justifying the use of the atomic bombs, saying it shortened the war and it prevented a land occupation that would have put a lot of soldiers in danger. But from the point of view of the Nazi, also the operation in Monte is the same. They lost just 7 people doing it this way. If they would have to look for the partisans and try to distinguish the partisans from the civilians, maybe they would have lost, for sure they would have lost more soldiers. How to connect the impact of the extreme sufferance with a scientific attitude? Another big topic. What we try to do is to have workshops that last one day, so that beside the testimonies and the empathic moment, then you can have also the mental space to then have a more rational reflection on the events. And also it means that all of us who work at the Peace School are not directly related with the people who were affected by the massacre. Because probably in that case it's too hard and it's probably also unethical. We work with the survivors, but I would never ask the survivors to reflect on the reason about why the Nazi how the Nazi justified the violence. It's illegitimate to ask something like that to someone who darkly suffered. I and my colleagues are supposed to have enough distance to be able to work on it. Then one problem is the tourism of memory. You know, how not to become. We have thousands of schools that comes every day. There are many buses and some guides, because there are many institutions that work on Monte. There are guides who do a very short tour because they have to do maybe 6 schools in the morning. And therefore, there is a problem. Maybe it's just a short ritual that you do, you know, the class come, they go to the site and they see some things and go home. And then maybe that's not the point if the aim is to reflect on the mechanisms of violence. Okay, maybe let's go on because it's... So, we found ourselves, and maybe it's interesting also for you, in this dichotomy that we are a peace school that is a memory site, but that also is supposed to work on reconciliation and peace education. And actually, the politics of memory and the politics of reconciliation, they have different aims, actually. So, usually the politics of memory aims to build strong symbols, because in this way you can identify yourself with it. It's usually connected with building consensus to the power system. If I can use Monte as an example, by the way, if you hear Marzabotto massacre, or you read Marzabotto massacre, it's Monte massacre. But it happened in Monte due to part of this memory, politics of memory here. The memory shift to the existing town where they build the monuments and the museum. And there is also in Lidice Marzabotska street. And in Marzabotto town there is Lidice, via Lidice. Okay. So, for example, the use of Monte that they called Marzabotto back then, in terms of consensus to the power system, for the Italian Republic that was born by the resistance movement. Okay, our constitutional fathers and mothers were members of the resistance to fascism and Nazism. Marzabotto, or that's to say the Monte massacre, was a way to say, look, Italians were not on the fascist side. Look at the price Italy paid in terms of civilians killed. So it was a message for the winning power of the Second World War, for example. Don't treat us like Germany, because we don't have, there was no that huge mass support that the Germans did to Nazism. It was a different dictator. Otherwise, it wouldn't explain why we were subject to such mass atrocities. And this was used by the Republic of Italy, for example, to try to be a founding member of the United Nations. Our first democratic government wanted to be in San Francisco in '46 and try to negotiate but the answer was no. And the politics of reconciliation has different aims, meaning that, for example, narratives are multiples, because you have to include all the different actors involved in the traumatic experience, the tragedy. Yeah, depending if you work only with the victims or also with the perpetrators, there are very different processes that you have to deal with. That includes an individual dimension, because the dealing with trauma, you can do it collectively, but it's also a very individual experience. While the politics of memory, usually it's always about collectivity. So, also about Monte, but maybe you can relate to also other memory sites. Politics of memory meant also that some specific individual memories were shut up. There were some survivors that were not usually invited because maybe what they were saying didn't fit fully with the official version, the public narrative that was established. An example, one survivor was saying when the Mongols arrived instead of when the Germans arrived. Why? That they treated it like a crazy person for many decades after the war. But actually, there were some of the SS soldiers who were from former Soviet territories. So there were troops who had Asian features. And now we know it due to the research. So this person was not lying, was saying really what she saw in that period. But it didn't fit with the narrative, no, they were SS, and so therefore they have to be pure German with Aryan features and so on and so forth. Or others like survivors critical towards the partisans, for example. They were usually not included in moments of public commemoration where partisans and survivors stood side by side. But the dimension of civil war meant that, of course, in that area, some of the people killed had members of their family who had fascist ideas. It's just that the soldiers didn't distinguish. They treated all the population as enemies, basically. They didn't distinguish about civilians and guerrilla fighters. Okay, let's go because I have not so much time. I already said many of this. Yeah, the problem in some of these dimensions of the politics of memory is that what you push under in one form or another, maybe after decades, comes back again in other forms. So, for example, yeah, excluding some fascist narratives, not to say that they were right, but not to allow them to express maybe in a negotiation, in a dialogue, where you can also criticize, or meant that now some of these memories are coming back in forms of neo-fascism. And maybe not necessarily back then those families were fascist, but maybe the fact that maybe you had, I don't know, an act of violence by an allied soldier, and you were not allowed to say it out of your family for many decades, meant that 3 generations after, you have a person who inherited this memory, like, yeah, they always told me like there were the good and the bad ones, but my grandma told me the truth. Allied troops were worst. It's an example of this kind of dynamic. Basically, what we try to do is to work on the promotion of human rights. And so we try to work with all the mechanism of violence. And we try to universalize some of the mechanisms. Every historical event is unique, of course. Luckily, there will be only one Lidice massacre, only one Monte massacre, as they happened. One Holocaust. But the mechanisms are the ones who repeats. And this is some of those who we usually work on. Because this maybe helps if the point is really to try to create a world where these things doesn't happen anymore. So the challenge is more to see how in our everyday life also we see some of these mechanisms. Yeah, as Todorov said, if you don't want the past to come back, it's not enough to revoke it. He added superficially, but maybe also just to revoke it is not enough. You know, actualize means, for example, in the case of Monte, to study war crimes that are similar. If we go on Italian responsibilities, for example, I think Czech Republic took part too, but in the one of the many operations in Afghanistan, like for example, Italian army had been there for 20 years. And of course, it was a similar situation sometimes to the one that the Nazi in Monte had to deal with all the risks connected, meaning the Italian army was the regular army who had to deal with guerrilla fighters, Talibans, who of course were mixed with the population, because of course we prefer to say there is the Afghan population oppressed and then this group of terrorists who controls them. But the reality is that of course these Talibans have families, and as the partisans in Italy in the Second World War, it means that maybe a 12 years old is bringing every day the food to his father, who is a guerrilla fighter. And therefore the risk is, if you lose the border between civilians and enemy fighters, then you risk to end up with these kind of things, which happened. If we think that because we are a democracy we cannot do this, then it's already a problem, because it doesn't depend on this, unfortunately. One factor that is very relevant is this: regular army against irregular army makes very hard for the regular army to distinguish who is the enemy and who is not. And yeah, it's basically what I've said. It's an investigation on genealogy of violence. And maybe just some of the ways in which we do it. We usually work in circles with every group, because in a circle we are all equal, and the role of our trainers, educators is more to moderate and ask questions. Both to create human empathy with the victims so that we feel their pain, but also not to shock. Otherwise, when you are too shocked, then you have to shut down. You know, it's a natural experience. Also concerning me this morning, some moments I had to look out or so on when you were sharing the stories. Not because but because as humans, sometimes it's hard to take all of it. Then you are not able to function, you know, and if you have to speak after some minutes, then it's not easy, maybe. And then this. So this is the missing step most of the time. Of course, it's dangerous, but if we don't do this, then no way that we can prevent this to happening again, because from the point of view of the victim, you have no clue on why it happened. If you really want to understand how to prevent, you have to put yourself here, not to justify, of course, but to understand when I can be in the same, with the same influences. When I risk to be the perpetrator is the real answer, the real question that we should ask. To make one last example with an anecdote, and then I'm done. I had a relation with a Croatian girl some years ago, for a long time. And her father at the beginning was not happy that she was with an Italian, then we got along. And he was very happy that I was working at the Peace School in Monte, because he said people should know what the Nazi did, especially young people. But he fought in the war that for him was the rightful war of independence of Croatia. And once he told me that he took part in operation where with his mortar he shoot at buildings of a town. Now, there was the Serbian paramilitary, but there were also the people living there. So he cannot exclude that he killed civilians. But in his mind, these were two completely different things. You know, the Nazi in Monte, the evil. What he did was justified. So the problem most of the time is to resist this temptation to say that the aim justifies the means. Because otherwise the risk is also, the important thing is to win. Because if you win, whatever you have done is justified. So atomic bombing is fine because we are the winner, so we were right. Whatever the loser has done is wrong because they are evil, because they are loser. And if we want to build a different world, we have to stick to crimes. And atrocity prevention is a struggle on an everyday basis. I hope it was not too confused. And here there is some bibliography. That's it.
Thank you very much, Stefano. That was fantastic.
One last, because I didn't say the project. So we work with schools, but also in areas of conflict, asking the people to come. So one of our historical projects is with Israeli, Italians, Germans, and Palestinians, for example, youngsters who live at the Peace School for 2 weeks, where, starting from the Monte massacre, they reflect on these mechanisms in everyday life. Or also, for example, till 2021, we were working also with Russians and Ukrainians in peace dialogues. We worked in Mozambique. We worked with, of course, former Yugoslavia.
Cheer again, because it's a really great job you do.
No, I'm happy to.